as it is now. All is realized as it is now. All is enlightened as it is now. Okay! So today, here in America, it is still March 10th. But in Japan already, of course, it is March 11th. And there are multiple things that we can remind ourselves of today on this Japanese March 11th. One, of course, is that this is the day that Soen Roshi took his last bath at Ryutakuji and slid into that warm water to be transported into this great transformation. And that was just today, 40 years ago. So March 11th, 1984, Soen Roshi departed this world we still inhabit. 40 years. Goes by fast, but still the spirit of Soen Roshi, even though I have never met him when he lived on this earth, it's palpable everywhere. And if there is one thing that I venture to do as an abbot for this Zen Studies Society is to make Soen Roshi's liveliness and approach to this practice continue and strengthen. And today we'll see from some of the pieces that I picked from his works what stands behind this uniqueness of Soen Roshi. There's another thing that I want to mention too, because today is also in Japan the day that this Higashi Nihon Daishinsai, or Santen Ichi, or we call it the Great Tohoku earthquake happened. We tend to forget about it. But at 2:46 Japanese time, the ground shook there for 6 minutes straight. Magnitude 9 to 9.1. Incredible damage done. It's estimated to be about $360 billion of damage. There were over 13,000 aftershocks. But the worst of all numbers is that 19,759 people were found dead. 6,242 injured, and another 2,553 still missing. It was the most powerful earthquake that Japan had recorded. The recording of earthquakes started around 1900. It is also the fourth largest and powerful earthquake that was recorded in all of the world since the year 1900. And you might remember that there was this nuclear power plant, Fukushima Daiichi Genshiri Ryoku Hatsudensho, that was overtaken by a tsunami. The tsunami is just incredible. the highest level of the tsunami was measured at the coast. The scientists could tell by how high on the rocks you could find the seaweed. And it was 40.5 meters. That is about 133 feet. It's quite an awesome experience how our human existence is so dependent on Mother Earth and how fragile of a system we put out there. Nobody ever thought that the power plant would not have backup power because a 40-meter, 130-foot tsunami just knocked out all the infrastructure. So we have to be very careful. But here also, I just wanted to mention these almost 23,000 people who expired then. My ordination teacher, Joshu Roshi, was born the same year as Soen Roshi. They were both born in 1907. Nakagawa Motoi was born not on the Japanese islands. He was born in Taiwan to Japanese parents. Joshu Roshi was born in Japan, near Sendai. And Sendai, of course, Miyagi Prefecture, is just a couple of miles away from that spot in the ocean where that earthquake happened. Joshu Roshi trained at various temples, and when he became a Roshi, he actually was the master of Yotoku-in, which is the Sodo, the monastery at Zuiganji. And Zuiganji is near Sendai. It's the Matsushima area, beautiful. And for some reason, the tsunami was kind of diverted and broken down because this temple is right where the water could get to very easily. But it had to kind of ricochet back and forth from the various bays that it had to cross. The Tsuiganji emerged unharmed. So, many connections to this day. But we are speaking about Nakagawa Soen Roshi. When you look what's hanging here on the right-hand side of the Butsudan, that is a calligraphy by Soen Roshi. It says, the translation is inexhaustible or inexhaustibility. Mu Jin Zo. Mu, like Joshu's mu, not, no. Jin as exhaust, run out of. And Zo, like the storehouse like Shobogenzo, the storehouse of the Dharma treasure. And there's one thing that you can really take right away from, I always thought about Soen Roshi as somebody who either liked deer or cows, you know? His way of writing characters such as storehouse. You have the horns and you have the face of that animal. If you go upstairs and you look at the flower character that hangs in the Dharma hall, again, one of those deer type characters. I have one at home too. And actually the one at home that I have is about the spring and how the cow walks in the spring. There's a lot of energy in Soen Roshi's calligraphies. We are very, very lucky to have so many. And it is nice that they will be displayed according to the occasion. and inexhaustible shall be our gratitude to Soen Roshi and all the ancestral human beings who are responsible for us being here and being alive. No, it's not just Dharma teachers. It's okay to thank our parents too, and their parents, and so on, and teachers, siblings, everybody. Inexhaustibility. So let's start here with Soen Roshi when he became a monk. He became a monk actually also in March, on his birthday. He got ordained at the age of 24 years by a master by the name of Keigaku Katsube. And Keigatsu Katsube was the teacher at Kogaku Ji. You know, Ji means temple. It used to, the founder of the temple never called it temple actually. He called it Kogatsu An. And An is like hut or hermitage. Because he was a very special teacher too. It was Basui Zenji. Basui Zenji, who lived in the 14th century in Japan, was kind of unorthodox. When he became ordained, he shaved his head, but he didn't wear the robes. He was in a monastery. He would do zazen all the time. The other monks would go chanting. He would do zazen. And so that was quite interesting, his approach to it. And I'm sure some of you know the essential question that Basui asked himself all his life long. Anyone?
Who is hearing this?
Yeah, who is it that hears this? Who is it that sees this? What is that spirit, soul, anima, kokoro, however you want to call it? That was his question. Who is this? Who is this? Who is this? And Basui inspired Soen Roshi and his approach to Zen quite a lot. So let's see what it says here in this book, which you all probably know, Endless Vow, which was put together by, it's presented with an introduction by Edo Taishimano Roshi, who of course is the Dharma heir to Soen Roshi. And also it was translated partially by Kazuaki Tanahashi and by Shinge Roshi. So a few things from here that are quite interesting. Soen Roshi probably had a tendency to be intense. Let's say intense. Intense in how he applied himself to his own studies and life. And when he took a vow, he would stick with it very, very strictly. So here this is from March 1931, the day he got ordained. He says, on March 19th, 1931, my 24th birthday, Keigaku Katsube Roshi shaves my head. Hangan ni misukasu, haru no mada samuki. Gazing with half-closed eyes, wintry spring. Soen Roshi's determination as a monk is summed up in his poem that he also wrote the same day. Suzushi saya kokoro o utsutsu mizu to sora. Clearness, sky and water, reflecting my heart. That's how he started out. On November 3rd, the same year, Soen Roshi writes, on October 3rd, I made a vow to live on 1 meal a day, following the teachings of the Buddhist scriptures. This has resulted in a new day clarity and expansiveness in my life. Now I realize that eating white rice is not healthy, and I'm changing to brown rice and using only brown sugar. 1931. The poem that goes with this. Ryo ryo to aki wa sumiyuko mi no hosori. Vast solitude. My thinning body. Transparent autumn. Sometimes in our practice, when we go to Sesshin and we have an opportunity, and if we are in good health, it's a very interesting way to also follow that and maybe just eat very little at 2 of the meals and just have 1 meal and follow the same way that the Buddha, before he became the Buddha, Siddhartha, learned from some of the Indian sages. Soen Roshi clearly did that, and it's so clear at that moment when we give our bodies a chance to experience something different in that setting of Sesshin, of clearing our heart and mind. We can really feel those differences. When we eat a lot, it suddenly feels like having like a ton of bricks in your stomach. Not only that, it pulls all the energy into it. And then comes Teisho and Joshu Roshi used to sit on a high chair, really high, the Teisho chair. And from there he could overlook everybody sitting. We were very strict still, no turning, nothing. Everybody was just sitting there in Zazen facing each other in the Dharma hall. And so what happened was that even though nobody, except the translator who sat next to him, barely anybody understood his Japanese. And he would speak, and then the translator would speak. And it would go like this. He would say something and everybody was listening. And then the translator started and people started. And then he spoke again. But sometimes we get so tired that even the Teisho doesn't wake us up. And there he looked down and said, "It is wonderful. The heads of the monks who apply themselves bob back and forth like ripe eggplants in the summer breeze." What, did he just call me an eggplant? Delicious. So, the thinning body. Now in autumn 1931, this continues a little more. Since making that vow, I have been experiencing the joy of practicing it. One evening, I hear a Zen teacher tell in his lecture about eating 49 sweet rice cakes at a time when he was young. I am appalled. But on my way back to the temple, I stop at the bakery and buy 1 of those cakes. It is like the initial gunshot breaking the silence. It creates explosive desire. One calls for another and another. I become so angry, even while devouring this unhealthy food, that I feel like a demon. Mi no yoku no maza maza sugoki yosamu kana. Bodily desire, viciously raging this barren night. Already here we can see that even though Soen Roshi was very, very observant of his own vows, he always left an opening to the humanity of himself and of us. How many things have we heard that appalled us and then gone and done the same thing in a slightly different fashion and not noticed? Not noticed. So this is the autumn of his early years. Let's jump forward just a couple years further. In autumn 1932. A little bit about Basui. The famous Basui, founder of Kogakuji, where I was ordained, appears to me and scolds. You have engaged in worldly affairs, writing poems and talking about secular matters. You are self-indulgent and are going against monastery regulations. In what place shall I chain you? I respond, Roshi. And he says, yes. I remain silent. He lets me go. Tera ni kite tsuyu yori chisaki hito narishi. Having entered the monastery, I now know my life is less than a dewdrop. So very strong relation to Basui. And Basui also a very strong Mahayana teacher. Mahayana, where this teaching of the Buddha is not limited to people becoming ordained. But anyone, even a non-Buddhist, can be the most perfect, great Bodhisattva, Dai Bodhisattva. Let's go to 1938. Sometime later, in autumn 1938, he's writing now already to Nyogen Senzaki-san, who already had been in the United States since 1906, being in exile in a completely foreign land. And Soen Roshi, who came into contact with Senzaki Sensei through his poems having been printed in a Japanese language magazine for housewives, the Fujin Goron. That's how they got to talk to each other, because the poetry impressed Senzaki Sensei so much. So here, autumn 1938, Soen Roshi wrote to Yogen. I have been studying your Teisho on the gateless gate, one after another. I feel emancipated just seeing the teachings conveyed in Roman letters rather than ideograms. What he means is Chinese characters written in Latin alphabet instead of Chinese characters. Zen, which is fundamentally about the emancipation of all beings, is unfortunately sealed in some square box called Zen. In this enclosure, the ancient dog in the koan, Joshu's Mu, has been suffocating. In English, this dog is so joyfully alive. Kushi. Kushi is the Japanese reading of that dog. So every monk, when they study the koans, it's all in Chinese, and then you have to learn how to read it in the Japanese way of reading Chinese characters, which goes a little, you skip one, you go back and forth to make up some sense. And then you have to learn it by heart, which of course is also a memorization exercise. So much for Zen not having anything to do with written stuff. It has to do with written stuff you can't read. Written stuff you have to learn how to pronounce, and then you have to present it. So, Joshu Oshu Chinamini Soto Kushi ni kaete Busho Ariya Mata Inaya Shu Iwaku Mo. That's how it reads. And that Kushi is suffocating in that box. Many, many heavy Chinese characters lying on that poor puppy. Especially that Buddha nature thing is so heavy. But as Soen Roshi said, does a dog have Buddha nature? Right? Right there. Very different. He already saw that in 1938 before he had any kind of idea what would be happening here. His poem here is Kukan ni aki mohatenaru utai kana. In an empty house, autumn is coming to a close. No chanting. He was very fond of no. The traditional way of chanting in a monastery in Japan, it has changed now. There are different styles. We have our own style here. But there's a one everyday type of chant. That's when you introduce or when you chant one of the dedications, and every time, and then there's some middle ground, and then there's a very, very formal with a lot of ups and downs, and it's quite ornate. And it's almost like no. And he really liked that. Chanting is such a wonderful experience anyway, to be able to give ourselves, to make our breath express our deep vow to be fully present. It's surreptitious that when we chant, because surreptitiously we learn how to elongate our breath. Because we just chant and we don't think about the breath. And when we run out, and we haven't even missed one syllable, you know? So much easier than Zazen. Let's go further forward in time. Spring 1955. In spring 1955, already Soen Roshi has come to America. And he writes, in Los Angeles, I hear there are 2 cars for every 5 people. And there's something called a freeway that goes in 2 separate directions, each with 2 or 3 lanes, with spiraling ramps. The drivers search for something called parking spaces. In the middle of the city, Japanese and American Buddhists established a Zen hermitage centering around old man Nyogen Senzaki. It seems Buddhism is still traveling eastward. I'm a guest here. a wandering wanderer, doing nothing. Jidosha no hitotsu, hitotsu ni kaze hikaru. Car after car, shining in the spring breeze. Yeah, Los Angeles, that's where in Little Tokyo, Nyogen Senzaki lived, and where the Tanahashi family had the laundry. I've been to Little Tokyo. Joshu Roshi liked to go there because he came in 1962, 4 years after Senzaki Sensei passed away. And in the meanwhile, people still tried to sit, and there are pictures of Shubin Tanahashi and Joshu Roshi at his first house where he stayed in Gardena in California. And there was no money for Buddhism at that time, not really. He had not eaten in 3 or 4 days at that time, Joshu Roshi, and finally the dentist who sponsored his coming over, Dr. Harmon, came and said, "Oh, you haven't eaten in 4 days, let me get you something." And he came back 20 minutes later with a loaf of Wonder Bread. And Joshu Roshi told the story, "Well, I was so hungry. I ate half the loaf. And then I sat down and prepared to die." It did not agree with him, apparently. And I would not recommend anyone to eat Wonder Bread to begin with. You wonder if it's bread. So already here, this childlike openness and curiosity that Soen Roshi expresses just speaking about the cars and parking spaces and the people is so refreshing. Like the water I will drink now so you can move. Let's go forward to 1958. January 1958. Bhikshu, a bhikshuni, upasaka, and upasika, which is monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen, are considered to be the 4 types of practitioners. Auspiciously, all of these kinds of Dharma friends are here, including Zen students from France and America, purifying the 6 sense organs. All together, we reach the top of Mount Fuji. That was in the time when Soen Roshi was the abbot of Ryutakuji in Mishima, from where you can see Mount Fuji. It happened to be that when Shingi Roshi and I and a couple of other people went there, Mount Fuji did not want to show itself. We were not able to see it. So I don't believe it exists. But when Soen Roshi was the abbot of Ryutakuji, foreigners, gaijin, were welcomed. And he made a lot of accommodations for them, forgiving not knowing the monastic protocol, but really honoring the deep desire and the deep determination to get to the bottom of this practice, coming to Ryutakuji French and Americans were there when he wrote this here. And they hiked up to Mount Fuji. And he wrote, "There is no Buddha other than this. Higher than Fuji, cloud mountains gleaming." He uses the term Dharma friends, Kalyana Mitra, Kalyana Mitra. We all are Dharma friends. We all ought to be Dharma friends with each other in the sense that we support our aspirations. We, without judgment, reflect so that we can see ourselves in each other's, and sometimes we reflect kindly, generously, the obvious shortcomings that we cannot see ourselves. That is what a true Dharma friend is. With the introduction of the Dharma teacher training program last year, and a graduating class of 9 Dharma teachers, this movement of becoming a Sangha of Kalyana Mitra with various levels of responsibilities has just begun. Like Basu, we wanted to have a monastery that is not just for full-time monks. Soen Roshi also wanted international Daibosatsu Zendo to be a non-traditional monastery. And this Zendo here to be non-traditional, that just means open for everybody. Rinzai Zen is some very, very special tradition. But one thing that it should not be is exclusive. So, again, with Basu and Soen Roshi, I have the intention to continue to move that forward in the 21st century, to open up and to allow really everyone who has this deep desire to become ordained to study and to train as it is possible in this 21st century, with the same intensity that we are monks when we enter the monastery and follow the monastic rules, that we are nuns when we enter the monastery and follow the rules, and really work deeply and vigorously in the way that somebody who has left home does. And then when that time comes to an end, return to the other Kalyana Mitras, to family, to the world, to the worldly affairs that just have been waiting for bodhisattvas who are in a training like that. And then return again. Leave home again. A true home leaver comes home and leaves home all the time, like Soen Roshi did. So that was 1958. 1958 is also just about the time that the Zen Studies Society was founded. It's the time when the Cambridge Buddhist Association was founded. That was the time when Suzuki Daisetsu, D.T. Suzuki, was traveling around in the academic circles here, Columbia University, Harvard University. So that's where these organizations originated, 1957, 1958. But let's go much further in the time. In September 1966, Soen Roshi writes, he was still at Ryotakuji. It's a time of potential crisis. The neighborhood surrounding the monastery, and that is Ryotakuji, will be made into a residential apartment area if we don't do anything about it. We at Ryotakuji are in the process of expanding the monastery grounds, planting pine, cedar, and cypress trees. This will be called the National Teachers Forest, Hakuin Forest. And it will provide a deep Zen practice place for future generations. Just think, someone like Hakuin, or even half the measure of Hakuin, may be born here in 500 years or 1,000 years. Such a person will increase the radiance of the Buddha's sunlight and will continue turning the Dharma wheel. We too will be at play in this forest, forging ahead on this unsurpassable path, birth after birth, generation after generation. Tochi Budoka Tonari, Tsutsuso ni Hiyayako. A monk in real estate, as shaky as raw tofu. Interesting translation, because it has the word, I don't know if you heard it, tochi. You know, tochi, that's real estate. But the next word, budoka. Budoka. It's the transcription of the word broker. Budoka. Tochi budoka tonari. Tsutsuso ni hiyayaku. Real estate, budoka. There are many English words in Japanese. They're like that. Stove, stove. Tape recorder. Record player. All kinds. But here, real estate broker, a monk as real estate broker, as shaky as raw tofu. Now, I want to end with a story that Soen Roshi told that really applies to all of us. And we all, you might have been here in January when I brought my staff here as the abbot. So think of that staff, you all have one, and here's the story that goes with it. There was a foolish servant whose master said to them, "This is a staff for the most foolish person in the world. Find someone more foolish than yourself and then give it to him or her. Until then, always keep it with you." The servant took the staff. Feeling mortified, he looked for someone more foolish than himself, but could not find such a person. Meanwhile, the master became gravely ill and was near death. He was bound for a destination far, far away. The fool asked, "Where are you going?" "I don't know," the master answered. "What route are you taking?" I don't know that either." "Are you all packed?" "Not a bit." Slapping his knee, the fool yelled, "You are leaving for a long journey and you don't know where you're going. You don't know how you're getting there, and you aren't ready to go. Indeed, you are the greatest fool in the world." The servant gave the staff to the master. Soen Roshi says, We all have such a staff, even though it is invisible. Thanks to this staff, this world is enjoyable. And the next world is enjoyable. It is said, someone who does not know is Buddha. If there was one thing that Soen Roshi did, is teach us all that we are okay as we are. Just go later and look at his facial expression in that picture on the Butsudan there on the altar. It's quite an interesting expression. What see we in it? Oh, look at him. What's that guy doing here? But we know what stands behind it. What takes a really, really long time to realize and to become comfortable with is that we all are okay as we are right now. Doesn't mean we can be okay tomorrow in a different way, even more awake, bright-eyed, open-hearted, or even on a gray day. Okay. Because, as he said, all is revealed as it is now. All is realized as it is now. All is enlightened as it is now.